Our problems didn't start here. They were with us all along, right under our noses. But we'd act like nothing's wrong. We'd see the echoes of the slave trade.
Welcome back to the Simple Questions podcast. I'm your host, Dylan Carnahan. That introduction was American Ghost by Jack Summers. That song is off of his album 4 Years. You can find that on SoundCloud as well as Bandcamp. So head over there and give Jack a listen. I'll also have links to his album and this song under the show notes for episode 3 at the website simplequestionspodcast.com. Now, today's episode is What Tattoo Should I Get? So, if you are in the market for a tattoo or simply just want to learn more about the subject, you've stumbled across the right episode. In this episode, we'll touch on the history of tattooing, the tattooing process, things to consider when getting a tattoo, and we'll have a little bit of fun along the way. You might be asking yourself the question, well, Dylan, who are you going to be asking these questions to? And I would reply to that with, I will be asking an owner of one of the oldest tattoo parlors in Kansas City. He is a third-generation tattoo artist with over 40 years of experience, and his name is Wes Grimm, the owner of Grimm Tattoo. So sit back and relax and listen to Wes and I's conversation, and hopefully you'll pick up some things along the way. Great. Well, firstly, I'd like to just thank you for even doing this. I really want to interview a tattoo shop, and you're like the first one I went to, and so to have you agree, I was pretty pumped about that. I kind of want to get into, the shop and you a little bit here, so can you tell me a little bit about how long Grimm Tattoo has been around and how it got started?
Well, my great-grandfather was born in 1900. And in 1916, he was 16 years old. He opened his first tattoo shop in Chicago on the Bowery, which was a part of town where they had quite a few tattoo shops, kind of rough part of town. And at 16, he put his name up on a sign and everything. And the story goes that his uncle came by and saw his name up there on a tattoo sign, and tore the sign down, beat him up, and said that he was going to ruin the family's reputation. So then he changed his name. He started using a trade name, Bert Grimm. And that's kind of where Grimm Tattoo starts, right there. And so that was 1916.
So how does the shop move around from there?
Well, Bert opened that tattoo shop. And an interesting thing, the story he tells, is that he was open there for some time, a few months, and Buffalo Bill walked in one day with a big announcement and said, "Oh, I heard that the best tattooer in Chicago was some kid named Bert Grimm." So he hired him for the Wild West show.
Really?
And so Bert worked for the Wild West show. But then, Buffalo Bill died that very next winter.
Really?
So that was the last Wild West show. And I believe the story is that from there he did lots of stuff. He was in the Army. He was in the Merchant Marines. He traveled with circus trains. That was a real popular way for tattooing to be done, was to travel with a circus train. Every circus had a tattooer.
Really?
Mm-hmm. And then, so 1926, he opened up a tattoo shop in St. Louis, and he was there till the 50s.
Huh.
And from there, he ended up in Long Beach, California. He's most known for his Long Beach work, because in Long Beach was the people that he tattooed there still have recent memories of being tattooed, whereas the people that he tattooed in the 20s and 30s and 40s in St. Louis, most of those are not around.
Yeah, so he's kind of lives on through his work a little bit.
His later work, he had a long career. He died in 85, and he's supposedly still working. People would still come by his house and knock on his door and want him to tattoo him.
What made his kind of tattooing, I guess, what drew people to him?
He had a really a showman like attitude, like that I assumed that he learned working for circuses, carnivals, and he would sort of bark as he tattooed. He would give you a story of himself in a kind of dramatic way. So he'd be tattooing you, and all of a sudden he'd say, "Well, you might not know you're being tattooed right now by the best tattooer in the world. By golly, it's true. And if you don't believe it, look at this quote in this newspaper. It says right there that Bert Grimm's the greatest in the world." And so he would go on like that.
Really? So he had it was kind of the process of his tattooing had like a showmanship quality to it.
It did. And then the style that he developed was very simple, and it's been emulated quite a bit even up to today, to even people even copying his original designs, the Bert Grimm designs. They're iconic, and so he developed that really well too.
What would be some of kind of those designs?
It's well, like the heart with the teardrops coming out of it, the crying heart, and there's quite a few things like that. And another thing he's memorable for is because his tattoo shop was sort of a central place for tattooing, and a lot of the West Coast really famous tattoo guys got a start there in that shop, and so it spreads out from there really wide.
He had an influence upon those other people that tattooed there. And that kind of...
He had influence on a whole lot of new generation, very influential tattoo artists. And so he's remembered for that as well.
How does Wes come into the picture here? How do you fit in?
Well, he taught my grandfather to tattoo. And when my grandfather began tattooing, he assumed the name. He was bestowed the name, Grimm. He tattooed as a Grimm. But then he decided that he'd like to teach me to tattoo. Back when he decided that, tattooing wasn't cool. Like, nobody I went to high school with wanted a tattoo. And
really?
So, yeah, it was kind of, and I knew Grandpa tattooed my whole life. But so that was kind of a Grandpa thing, you know.
It was aged.
It was like playing checkers or something. Like something I just don't care that much about. I had other things to do. I rode a motorcycle. I worked on a riverboat. Had all this other stuff going on. And Grandpa wanted me to come over and do Grandpa thing with him.
Yeah.
So my mom finally started bugging me. She said, "Well, why won't you go help your grandfather?" Well, I've been helping grandfather since I was a little kid. You know, he'd always call me up to come help carry hay or build fences and stuff like that. And so when he wanted help, I started going over and just helping him. And then he started me drawing and painting designs. And I'd stand over his shoulder and watch him tattoo. That went on for a year or so. He tattooed mostly bikers. But back then, when I started in 1980, I actually started tattooing. In 1979 or so, I started hanging out. And back then, the only two people that got tattoos were sailors and bikers. And so great-grandpa, he worked on the West Coast, really near a sailor training center. And Grandpa tattooed bikers. He pulled a little trailer and he'd go to all these motorcycle events in the Midwest, which there were quite a few, swaps and rallies and races and things like that. And so that's what I did for a year. I just followed him around. And then in 1980, great-grandpa flew to Kansas City, and I was on a riverboat. I worked on a riverboat 30 days on, 30 days off, 30 days on, 30 days off. And I happened to be on the boat. Great-grandpa flew to Kansas City, and they opened a shop at 38th and Main, which was basically more a place to house all of our traveling tattoo stuff, you know.
Really?
Yeah, because it was all travel-oriented. Like all the tattoo designs were in hangars that you could deploy, basically, instead of individual like frames on the wall.
It was very mobile.
Yeah, so the whole thing was mobile, yeah. And so we opened up a little bitty shop there at 38th and Main. And then we were there for almost 20 years. Grandpa sold me the place after 3 or 4 years, and I continued operating it for almost 20 years.
So you kind of gain that exposure from your grandpa, kind of just watching him, traveling with him.
Mm-hmm, yeah, and that's a funny thing too. Great grandpa tattooed the way he tattooed in the 40s. He kind of technical stuff, but he had one-piece springs with no capacitor on these old fossil machines of his. And so, and I started that way. He didn't use a spray bottle. He used a bucket and a sponge. And it sounds horrible, but they would change that every time. So it was always antiseptic, clean, warm, soapy water. And but no spray bottle. The first time I saw a guy use a spray bottle on a tattoo, I thought, that's genius. So I started the exact same way they did. I tattooed the way Grandpa did. He tattooed the way Bert did. We tattooed side by side. It was seamless. You couldn't tell the difference between any of us because that's the way you did it. We used instead of an armrest, we used a foot block and a lap cloth. It was very archaic. Big blue flame on your tattoo machine because there's no capacitor. And if you touch that thing, it'd shock you. So let's see what else. There was carbon stencils. I had never seen one of these purple stencil tattoo machine stencil makers. We used a carbon stencil, which you scratched a piece of clear plastic and then you rub burnt bone in it into the cracks, and then you put a thin coat of Vaseline on and pressed it on real carefully. Now, if you touched that thing, it was gone.
Really? It was that
fragile? It's not like that permanent 3M purple paper stuff. Yeah, it was real fragile. If you touched it, it'd be gone. So it was a different, even method to tattoo. You'd have to start to line it. You'd have to start at the very bottom and carefully do the line as you went up so that you didn't erase the line with your elbow while you're doing the top part, you know.
Wow.
So even the method of doing it was like really archaic.
How have you kind of, I guess, changed as an artist?
Well, right away I started doing all that old stuff, and then right away after I became involved in tattooing, I started meeting other people that were doing it and seeing that this was the old way. And I picked up a lot of stuff. I started going to tattoo conventions. I went to a tattoo convention in Reno, Nevada, National Tattoo Club, I think in 1981 or 82. And so from there on, I started trying to emulate the new ways, you know, which was kind of a revolution going on because we suddenly started wearing gloves and being a lot more conscious of being safe.
Mm-hmm. You had a revolution not only of the aesthetic of tattooing, but also, like as you mentioned, the ways in which you
even the technology that we were using, because I started using capacitors and two-piece springs and the purple stencil machine. When I started tattooing in 1980, no private person had a copy machine.
Yeah.
No one did. I mean, if you saw a copy machine was at a big bank or something, and they were the size of a Buick.
Yeah.
You know, one person couldn't even pick up a copy machine. So it was several years into tattooing before you could even go down there and hit the button that says, shrink it down 10%.
Yeah.
If you wanted to shrink it down 10%, you had to sit in front of it and draw it on a piece of paper. You know. Even the technology's changed quite a bit. Now with tattooing, anything that makes tattooing quicker makes it a little bit more affordable. And you think back when they were doing it by hand before electricity, it might take all day to do one tattoo. Now when they started using an electric tattoo gun, you could do 10 tattoos in one day. So it's 10 times faster.
Yeah.
Well, that guy's going to make more money. He can actually lower his prices because he's working the same amount of time. He's working 8 hours. This guy's working 8 hours. This guy's doing 10 times as much. He could charge only twice as much and just squash this other guy.
You could also,
So what it did is it made it available to everybody could afford it now because you could do 10 of them in a day, so you didn't have to charge, so much. You could charge a little bit less on each one. So it made it affordable and it made it very popular. So once the electric machine made it go through sort of a revolution where everybody wanted to use it. And what did that was that the electric machine was faster. So anytime if you make tattooing faster, you're going to get more on your menu than the other guy. So like if you see everybody drawing on an iPad now, you say, oh, that's not the old way. You guys don't know how to draw because you're not drawing on paper anymore and all this stuff. But if it makes them faster, then you're going to get left in the dust. I don't care how much that you love the old way.
Mm-hmm.
If you're not as fast as what they're doing now, then you're going to get left behind. And then tattooing, if you put a stick in the mud and say, I'm not going any further than this, you're going to get left behind.
Yeah. So you kind of mentioned, obviously speed, the impact that has on the tattoo artist. And you mentioned that made it more accessible. And earlier you kind of talking about how, predominantly bikers and sailors, like Navy men, kind of how do you think the demographic for tattooing has changed over time?
Well, it's a lot different now because it's more accepted in society. Now you can get a job now with a tattoo on your arm. Used to be you couldn't be a cop, you couldn't be a fireman, you couldn't be a waiter. It's a lot more accepted. I had an interesting time when I went to work in Hawaii. It was a time period there. I've been tattooing for 40 years, so for like a 10-year stretch or so, I used to work in Hawaii for the whole winter. I'd go over there at the end of October, and I'd come back at the beginning of May and just skip the winter. And in Hawaii, I experienced something that I'd never experienced anywhere else, and that is in Hawaii, there's a place in their culture for tattooing.
Mm-hmm.
So that they find you're a tattoo artist, you had suddenly a status in society. And I personally have never had status in society. Being a tattoo guy on Main Street, it's pretty much counterculture sort of thing to be doing, And so that visible, palpable honor that they bestow upon you for being a part of the community like that was moving. I'd never experienced that before.
That is really interesting.
And it was a real thing you could count on. Like I remember, for instance, at the airport one time, they was looking at my bags, and they start taking all my. I got a lot of tattoo stuff, and they start getting weird and looking at my stuff. And a big old guard walks over, a big old Hawaiian guy walks over there. He peeks at it a little bit. He was the one with the uniform on, and he said, "You tattoo guy?" I said, "Yeah, I work over Skin Deep." He goes, let him through. Just like that.
Really?
Tattoo guy, yeah.
Really interesting. I never thought about that kind of social dynamic and how it's different elsewhere.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Hawaii's a great place to work because, you hear about Hawaii. Well, it's expensive over there. Well, yeah, it is. There's two parts of expensive. There's the part where you have to pay, so you don't want to make your money in the Midwest and spend it all in Hawaii. But if you make your money in Hawaii where things are expensive and spend it here, now it's not expensive, it's lucrative.
Yeah.
Yeah, things are expensive in Hawaii, so when you turn your hand over and say, pay me, you're getting a bigger paycheck. So that was a wonderful thing.
So that's
working in Hawaii in the winter time, I got to recommend it to anybody to figure it out. I used to go over there, when I first started doing that, I knew what I was doing, so I knew I was going to go over there. End of October, everything's dead and gray, And so when you get to there, you get off the plane, everything's just alive and lush and green and humid. There's a beautiful breeze blowing. It's just so beautiful. And this feeling would overwhelm me that was so unfamiliar, I didn't know what to think of it at first. It felt good, but it was real unfamiliar. I had never felt like that before. So it would eventually wear off a little bit. And then, so the next year I'd go there again, beginning of the winter, everything's dead and gray. Get to the airport, and when I get off the plane, I would start getting that feeling again. Real unfamiliar. Well, about the third time, it was starting to get familiar. I said, oh yeah, I remember feeling this. And I finally put my finger on what that was. I felt smart. I'd never felt like that before.
What made you feel so smart?
Well, I just left 10 million people freezing there. And I'm going to spend the winter making a bunch of money in Hawaii. Why doesn't everybody do this? Why?
It was a good seasonal gig.
Oh, yeah.
The tattoos you did in Hawaii differ from that of the Midwest. What was requested?
It added more to my palette because there's also a Hawaiian tattoo language that I was allowed to converse in. And So it added quite a bit to just my general rounding.
So that kind of brings me to a question. What are kind of the main styles of tattooing?
Well, when you want to think about the main styles of tattooing, what you're really talking about is varying cultures.
Okay.
Different cultures have different, not only but subject matter, drawing styles, and even instruments. So there's a Polynesian style where they sort of tap it in, and it's a lot of geometric patterns.
Okay.
And then so you go to Japan, well, they sort of do an opposite polar thing that we do in the West, where they'll make a sort of a light image with a huge dark background. And what we tend to do is to have a skin background, light, and then put one single dark image there.
Really? So
it's a single point, and then they do. So that's sort of the difference there.
What about kind of, as you mentioned earlier, kind of the old way to do things in America, like, you know, traditional tattooing versus kind of like this new wave stuff? What about those distinct styles?
I'm not sure. I know what you mean, but there's always been a really diverse imagery, and the tattoo guys are always sort of trying to catch that. And even sometimes, you know, even the old, most traditional designs you can imagine can be done in new ways. New ways to color and things like that.
So you kind of mentioned there's a lot of different ways that you can do, you know, old school tattoos. You can do things a lot of different ways. What are kind of some of the common, I guess, subjects that people bring in to get tattooed?
Well, it just varies so greatly. Everybody has a different reason and different imagery in their head, and most people have, you know, expectations that you can't even fathom. So it just varies with people's imagination.
So you get quite a wide variety. I know earlier we were kind of talking about the flashes. Can you kind of describe that again?
Is the designs on the wall. It's an old carnival term, and it's a traditional way to be tattooed is to come in to see a design, a traditional imagery that you like, point at it, and walk out the door with it. It's kind of a traditional old style of getting a tattoo. Now nowadays there's a lot of really fine art can be involved, and a lot of artists like to look at what you want to do, and then, you know, take some time to make a drawing and make an appointment for you for later. And we still like to kind of keep it spontaneous and actually sort of do it on the spot. It's the hardest way to really practice this art because it's so immediate. You know, you have to satisfy people's expectations on the spot as an artist.
What kind of things can you do to kind of bridge that gap to make it easier?
Well, one thing you do is there's ways to get in your clientele involved and invested in what you're doing. Like one thing you could draw it right in front of them, so they can see how the thing's developed and everything. Instead of like if you leave them and then come back with a drawing, it cheapens it somehow. They don't understand what it took to get there. So they might look at it and go, oh yeah, but could we do it from the a 3/4 angle instead of straight on? And they don't see that you just don't go back there and wave a wand over it and it just flips over. If you draw that thing in front of them, they watch every line come crawling together on the page until it finally starts looking at something they can recognize. And so they get invested like that.
It's kind of, there's a level of artistry to it. And so kind of
involvement with people getting the tattoo. When they're involved in it like that, they're more invested in the end result. Instead of just going, oh, that was great, but could you do it like a different way? Could you do 5 or 6 so I can kind of pick one? Mm-hmm. You want people to be more involved so you don't draw the same thing all day long.
That kind of is reminiscent of kind of like your great grandfather a little bit. Kind of
Yeah, the immediacy is what the culture. As I spoke about earlier. The thing about culture is like I have a culture. Everyone's got a culture, but it's learning to build on what came before. Like I don't have to learn every single little trick about building a tattoo machine or mixing ink because that was brought to me. So I could take all that and go on from there. Like maybe bring an innovation or add something to it or also, concentrate on other aspects of what I'm doing. It's that culture that we bring and it gets passed up whether you even realize it or not. This sort of method of the way that I like to see the tattoo shop run. I didn't invent that. This is all these little things that you could just take for granted here was brought to me. I learned.
And then, built off of.
Yeah, and that's what I bring here. That's why there's, 5 tattoo guys out there. They're spread out pretty wide, but they can all see and hear each other, and they're all get along. They're all friends because it's the atmosphere, which is part of the culture. I couldn't have a thing where there was a war, or half was against the other half, or something like that. It's like who could work there? You know what I mean?
Yeah. Just
things like that. Look around in here, you see there's hot sauce on the shelf. Doesn't have nobody's name on it. It's like we share a common area, and we know how to do it because we have a culture that allows us to this freedom to share with each other and not worried that somebody's stealing from you, and to be able to contribute. My very favorite people that I love to work with are people that allow me to be generous. If someone allow you to be generous, then they're your best friend. If you can't be generous to somebody because they take advantage of you or they steal or whatever, you can't be generous with people that steal.
There's the authenticity. You can't be open with someone.
Yeah. So, that the atmosphere, just bringing that kind of thing, like a safety standard and like that immediate atmosphere where we can do this, like we can do it right now. It's the way we do it. It's all part of my culture.
If someone was wanting a tattoo, how do you usually decide where to place it?
Well, generally what you want to do as a professional, find out general area that they want to get the tattoo in. And then you look at the design, whether, it should face forward or backwards, that kind of thing. And then you want to decide on a general size for that area. And then you'll make the stencil. And then as an artist, from there on, you want to kind of take the reins. You don't want to keep getting steered around by the customer. I mean, as a professional, what you want to do, what they're here to get from you, is your artistry, your understanding, and your wisdom, and your expertise, your experience. That's what they're trying to get from you. So when you say, well, where do you want it? And they say, on my shoulder. From there, as an artist, you ought to be able to say, all right, and this is where it should be placed, and this is the direction it should face, and this is the size that it ought to be here. And then instead of going through every phase of that, say, well, how big do you think you ought to make it or whatever? You should take it from there, and the whole process be a process of an artist finishing a piece of artwork in generally the right area.
How does kind of the pain vary, I guess, in locations to?
Yeah, it varies greatly, and it depends a lot on individual. Some people, some people are sensitive one place and not so much the other, and so it varies a lot. There's a few things that are pretty universal, like the easiest place to get tattoos outside of your arms.
Okay.
And then, the more delicate places to get tattoos and, other places. Ankles are kind of tough because they're just so bony and everything.
And does that not only alter like kind of the how the tattoo appears, but also the pain? This is kind of a more bonier area.
Well, not really, not if it's done right. Well, you're not really tattooing bone, you're just tattooing skin. So if you keep it in the right parameters, then the look shouldn't change much at all. The skin does change from area to area, like the palms of your hands and the bottoms of your feet. Skin's really, really thick, so you can get a little difference of a result than if you're doing a protected area like the inside of your arm.
What are kind of the factors that determine like the time it takes for a tattoo to be completed?
Well, it depends on the size of it, the detail, and how much resistance you get from the customer. Some people can sit down and just let you work, and some people have to jump up out of the chair every once in a while. So, it can vary greatly.
Like, give me an example, say like a 3-inch intricate tattoo.
Well, here's a good, interesting thing, is that the humans are pretty much alike in a lot of ways. I mean, there would be some variations. And about a 3-hour tattoo is usually about all anybody wants to endure. Now, you can see people sitting there for 5 or 6 hours, but you get a diminishing result as you go along. Because they have to take more breaks and things like that. You think of it this way. If you sat down in a chair and my boot was in the chair and you sat on my boot, you can sit there for 5 or 10 minutes. It's not, you're just sitting on a boot. It's not comfortable, but, it's not going to kill you. But if you had to sit on that boot and drive to Wichita, by the time you got to Wichita, it takes about 3 hours to get to Wichita. You couldn't wait to get out of that car. And tattooing the same kind of way. You're just sitting on a tiny, tiny little needle. It's not that bad. Don't even go in that deep. It's not like, say, burning yourself with a cigarette. It's not going to make you jump or anything. You can endure it. It's just not that comfortable. But after 3 hours, most human beings will be done. And so I personally, if you're going to try to save some money on your tattoo, best way is to not get tattooed more than 3 hours at a time. Is the 4th hour, you're going to get maybe 45 minutes worth of work done. And the 5th hour, you'll be lucky if you get a half an hour's worth of work done. In the 6th hour, you'll gladly just sit there and chat with your tattoo artist while time ticks away.
Because
you're just done. Like, get me out of this ride.
That is a good point. Just the consistent irritation. You can only withstand it for so long.
Mm-hmm. It's just uncomfortable, and it takes a certain amount of energy to resist it. And after 3 hours or so, most people are just wore out. They just don't have the energy anymore.
So how do you figure the cost of a tattoo? Say.
I tell you how you figure the cost of a tattoo is you price a tattoo so that you can start it and finish it and do the best job that you can do on it and feel happy about it. If you get partway through that tattoo and think, I should have charged more money on this, then you just cheated your customer, because you didn't provide them with the opportunity to give you enough money to be interested until you're done with it. That's how much tattoo costs. Whatever it costs to get the artist to be interested enough in the thing to do it from beginning to end. You only got one chance.
Yeah, that's a very interesting way to look at it.
When I started tattooing, I was like, they said, okay, well, you can start doing tattoos. And I was like, well, who's going to let me tattoo them? And Grapple said, well, you're going to tattoo price repeaters. I said, what exactly is that? He said, you watch, there's plenty. And so a guy walks in and he says, how much for this tattoo? Grandpa says, $100. The guy says, $100? Price repeater. $100, he says. Grandpa looks at me and smiles. He says, yeah, $100. And he points at me and he says, my grandson there has never done a tattoo commercially, and he'll do it for half price. Well, guess what the price repeater says? He's a price repeater. He says, half price? So he never had to lie to anybody about my experience.
Because
then 2 days later, a guy come in and say, how much? $50. And he'd say, $50? And Grandpa would say, well, my grandson's there, been tattooing for, 2 weeks or whatever. He'll do it for half price. Half price? and went all the way through this. You know, grandson's there only been doing it for 6 months, but he'll do it for $20 cheaper. $20 cheaper. And just price per they walk in there now, same still do.
And then
That's who you practice on.
That's pretty funny. So we've kind of talked about a lot of things, but I'll kind of circle back to where would you personally recommend not getting a tattoo?
On your eyeball. That's been disastrous for many people, and just don't seem right, does it?
Personally, no. To share my personal opinion, I wouldn't do it. By any means.
Glad to hear it.
Any other kind of areas that, you talk about kind of the skin being thicker in some areas?
Well, the places that are visible have social consequences. They still do. You can't expect to put funny tattoos all over your face and not have people laugh at you.
So that's kind of plays a large role as kind of maybe the social.
So, yeah, you want to put your tattoo where you can live with it.
And if you're ever second guessing that, then it's probably not a good placement.
It used to be a thing when I started, before I even got there, but it was in place when I got there in the 70s. I started tattooing in 1980. But it's still there. And some of the people that had been in tattooing for a while, they had this philosophy that they were sort of sharing and trying to present to the public. And to be in agreement on was that they'd ask the question, is this good for tattooing? Does what you're doing make tattooing look like not a dumb or criminal or stupid thing to do? And so you just stop and ask yourself that. So if a guy came in and said, well, I want, Scooby-Doo on my forehead, and you'd say, stop and say, well, does this make tattooing look good? Doing something like that. And if the answer is no, you just say, well, no, we don't really do that. So it sort of kept tattoos off of hands, faces, necks.
Kind of a honor kind of thing amongst tattoo artists, being protective of their craft.
Yeah, and sort of an aesthetic that we'd hope to all agree on, at least that.
So that was kind of an unwritten rule, if you will?
Yeah. It may have even been written in a few unofficial places.
How long do tattoos last generally? I know that, people you can get a touch
Well,
of.
a Grimm tattoo is guaranteed for life. It really won't. If it's done right, a tattoo's a permanent mark. It won't need to be done again, ever, if it's done right. So that's the standard we hold ourselves to. That's what we're trying to achieve.
Really? So come in, you get one, boom.
Guaranteed for life.
Well, that kind of leads me to, I guess, my last question, which would be, how would someone go about getting a tattoo here at Grimm Tattoo? What's kind of the process?
The funnest way is come up to the door, let us know you're here, we'll get you in, sign you up, we'll get an artist to look at whatever references you might bring, or describe your tattoo, or allow you to pick one out, whatever it takes. They'll sit down and make a drawing for you, and then take you back there and tattoo you.
Is it usually on the spot like that?
Hopefully, yeah. That's the way we like to run it. But sometimes if you get backed up, you might have to wait. If you can't be first, you can be next. We try to have at least 2 artists working here, 2 shifts a day, 7 days a week. You do the math. That takes like 8 artists for everybody to get 2 days off. Only have to work 1 shift, 5 days a week. For 2 people to be here 7 days a week, it takes 8 or 9 guys.
Yeah.
We got them. We're doing it. So you can get a tattoo here.
The availability.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and this, the difference between a podunk cowtown and a live, vibrant, metropolitan, world-class place, is a lot of nightlife. is there something to do here after 7 o'clock? Is there many places where you can go get a tattoo at night? You know, who's open till midnight? So, you know, we'd like to bring the party, you know. We're what makes Kansas City not just dead and cold and dark at night.
We're
awesome. Bringing it.
12 hours a day with 8 artists.
12 hours a day, 7 days a week, except Christmas.
Well, again, I appreciate you taking the time to do this. Thought we had a good discussion.
That was fun, thanks.
Well, that concludes the interview with Wes Grimm. I hope that you guys enjoyed that. I hope you learned about the evolution of tattooing, a little bit about how to determine the placement and style of your tattoo, as well as kind of getting a deeper understanding of the tattooing experience from an artist's perspective. And ultimately, I hope that helped you understand the process that you might go through if you're wanting to get a tattoo. If you're interested in getting a tattoo from Grimm Tattoo, feel free to look them up at grimmtattookc.com, as well as you can simply give them a call or stop by the shop off 39th and Broadway. They are open, as Grimm mentioned, 12 hours a day, 7 days a week. So they will be available fairly often, and they will take care of your tattooing needs. Looking forward to the next podcast episode. If you are a musician that would like to be included in the introduction, simply DM me on the social media accounts for Simple Questions Podcast, or shoot me an email at dylancarnahan@simplequestionspodcast.com. Whatever platform you're listening to this podcast on, whether that be Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, whatever it may be, feel free to give us a subscribe and follow. That way you can stay tuned for next episode, as well as I have a plethora of information in the show notes provided at simplequestionspodcast.com. If you'd like to learn more about Wes Grimm and Grimm Tattooing, I have additional resources provided in the show notes for this episode 3. Next episode might cover a topic that's fairly different than the previously discussed topics in these episodes. It could include finance, could include history. I'm currently pursuing several different topics right now. If you would like to ask a question and have me find someone within our community to answer that, feel free to submit a question via social media or through the website. Stay tuned for that, and like always, keep asking questions.